Right. Good afternoon. We will continue our discussion of the central bank and central bank independence that we were talking last week. And as I said, if you want to clarify anything a little more detail, you can send a question. You can write it through chat mode. Then we can follow it up. So we have a very important area also to start today. Most likely the money supply process we will start as we move on, but we will finish off the central bank independence that we were discussing last week. And there's two arguments in terms of central bank independence. One is against independence and one is for independence. Okay, and broadly, I mean, we touched upon the cases where people argue in support of independence, and then of course the case against independence, that is more or less trying to kind of figure it out, a democratic principles, and then see a group of influential influential group of people that they are responsible for central bank, and they are trying to kind of take a decision that actually influences the entire economy. So that's the broad argument. And for independence, you already know political pressure is always in favor of inflationary bias. So they wanted to see the expansionary policies irrespective of economic circumstances. And then of course we talked about political business cycle. Their election cycles are often not in line with the economy's developments, or for that matter the requirement in terms of the objectives where the central bank's been established. So the political business cycle would favor expansion policies irrespective of economic circumstances and irrespective of what's the underlying objectives of central banks, and they try to kind of maximize their re-election. So that would jeopardize overall economic stability, and also the requirement that the economy is being favored of maintaining a low price level, and of course using resources that mean full employment objectives of most of the central banks. Okay, and case for independence also supports the fact that central bank could be used to facilitate, if you don't have independence, for treasuries budgetary deficit. So the expansionary or accommodative policies would be favored by government or the treasury at the expense of overall stability in the economy, both in terms of achieving a price stability objective, lower price levels, lower inflation, and also for that matter they would promote money printing at the expense of long-term stability of the economy. So this favors that central bank should have independence, then they can face off treasury's financing requests. And also other element is the principal agent problem. You all have studied this principal agent problem all throughout. Principals of politicians are the general public, so the agents are the politicians. So the agents, irrespective of sustaining overall economy, they probably take shortcuts, and they probably require economies to pump in a lot of money, in fact the accommodative policies, and maintaining lower interest rates irrespective of economic circumstances. So thus it is not necessarily something you can leave it out to politicians to decide. So the independents argue that when you have independence, you can face off these challenges much more appropriately, given recent experiments and examples of different central banking episodes all around the world. And also case against independence, as you already know, undemocratic. You simply know that explanation. And then also you see unaccountable explanation. But this unaccountable explanation is also something that you can see it in terms of a non-applicability in today's context, because you see most of the time central banks are accountable in the form of regular reviews by the parliament, senates, or for that matter, even the presidential commissions, special commissions, audit inquiries, both internal and external, and regular submission of their final reports. So this unaccountability also another way of looking at it. But why people say central banks should not have independence is because they are undemocratic, and they are saying that sometimes they are unaccountable. Then also the difficulty in coordination between fiscal and monetary policy. So monetary policy might require interest rates to be tightened, that means increased, where fiscal policy would require interest rates to be loosened, reduced. So there's a conflict. This coordination challenge would make most of the time the fiscal and monetary policies to kind of compete against each other. Okay, and also another way of putting this independence into perspective is that the central banks who had independence have not used their independence successfully. So this is also another argument. All around the world, the central banks had independence, but they could not manage the inflation, and also, for that matter, the economic sustainability. So these been argued against giving independence to central banks. So you have arguments for, arguments against independence in central banks. And then, of course, looking at the behavior of central banks, one view of one could argue is the bureaucratic behavior. Okay, so bureaucratic behavior, that's where the bureaucracies, that means the public administration, serve the public interests. Okay, so one could mention that this as the public interest view, where you serve the public and public interest is prioritized. Yet some economists highlight the fact that they called this theory of bureaucratic behavior that suggests other factors that influence how bureaucracies operate. Irrespective of public interest, there are other factors that may influence the bureaucracy's behavior. So this is no longer like something that you can in isolation evaluate, because you see most of the time different legislations now challenge sometimes the bureaucracies to work independently. So the central bank's behavior also to some extent been governed by different legislations, that means different acts, different laws put in place, and also in terms of even in Sri Lanka's case, you can say right to information, RTI, Right to Information Act, which in a way brings in so-called the governance arrangements. So you had to reveal, and if the public sees the value of this information that is not publicly available, they could request. So these informations need to be shared, but this might be not under the normal general circumstances. They might not be shared and openly available. But now with the different laws, governance-related consideration, the bureaucratic behavior not only kind of prioritize public interest, but also bring in other factors into the equation. Okay, so the bureaucratic behavior theory is a useful guide to predicting what motivates central banks and other people, other monetary authorities to kind of behave in a certain manner, and you can kind of deliberate, argue why they are behaving in this fashion, what driving their behavior. So all there. So one possibility is that's power related, but I'm just taking through the same argument. So the behavior related theories argue the objective of the bureaucratic behavior to maximize their own welfare or bureaucracy's own welfare, which is again related to power and prestige, right? So they maintain a certain influence across the economy, so we enter to maintain it. And they also have acceptance in the society. That's the prestige, though they wanted to again maintain it, okay? So they, under whatever circumstances, the bureaucratic behavior of the agencies that we are discussing here, the central banks, they also fight to preserve that independence or the autonomy. So they wanted to see that the power and prestige maintained. Okay, so because of that reason, they try to avoid establishing conflicting with more powerful groups. For instance, the political authority, they try to kind of avoid creating conflicts and thereby preserving their autonomy, right? So to say that they try to accommodate even the political influence when it comes to the behavior in central bank. So this is not necessarily something strange to anybody, even in Sri Lanka's case, but across the globe, even the Fed Reserve, US central bank, you probably read in recent times, the President Trump is openly criticizing US central bank's Fed Reserve chairman. But they maintain it, but invariably they bringing some accommodative policies, and the strength of these accommodative policies were further supported by recent COVID related developments. So the central banks, not only in US, not only in Sri Lanka, but across the globe, try to kind of maintain the balance between their prestige and power, and try to kind of, bring in more amenable focus into the decision making and operation. Okay, at the same time, they also does not rule out altruism, so they try to kind of maximize their welfare, but at the same time they're also looking at the ways through which the priorities of the economy nation being factored in. So this explanation of behavior is no different across majority of the central bank in Sri Lanka, all across the world. So you see these developments. These developments are continuing, and then you see the structure and independence of other major central banks. For instance, you see European Central Bank. We were telling with the European Union being established, independent central banks of different countries in the Europe, right, have been transferred to the kind of a more centralized central bank operation, that is ECB, European Central Bank. Okay, so this is also patterned. I mean, the way that been established is in line with the Fed Reserve, US Central Bank. Okay, so here what you simply see is centralized board of governors, Fed Reserve's board of governors role being played from the center, while you see this different Fed Reserve Bank in US. That's the kind of a setup in different country. I mean, central banks in each EU member countries, they play a similar roles as Fed Reserve banks in different districts. So you can see the kind of arrangement which is very much in line with the Fed Reserve setup in the ECB. So the board of governors here in ECB's executive board, there you see a president and a vice president and 4 other members. That means altogether 6. And their term is 8, whereas Fed's was 14 and Sri Lanka's 6, right? So you see the number of members, again 6, 8-year term, then non-renewable. Once appointed, they continue and they will not be reappointed. Okay, so this executive board is the board of governors, but then you see a governing council also exists in the case of European Central Bank that has more representation with other members coming in, but mostly the executive board is the main, like, monetary board in the case of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, right? And of course, some difference in terms of ECB, and also the Fed Reserve. So you see this national central bank in Europe control their own budgets and the budgets of ECB. Okay, and again, monetary operations, in the case of Fed Reserve, it is reasonably centralized, but execution could be through Fed Reserve banks in different districts. But in the case of ECB, it is not necessarily centralized. It is basically run by different national central banks, but they act as Fed Reserve districts in the case of US. And of course, another interesting element is Fed Reserve has the financial supervisory arrangements, but ECB does not supervise and regulate financial institutions. They give it to a independent separate arrangement called FSA, Financial Services Authorities, in most of European countries. But there are some movement again to bring back the financial supervision back to the central banks, like in UK, ECB, it is the Bank of England, BOE, the Central Bank of UK. So they initially diversified the regulatory function to FSA, but then after the financial crisis, they brought it back. So there's a kind of a push in terms of bringing back regulation also into the central banking consideration, but still ECB is in principle working under a arrangement where the supervision does not come under their purview. Okay, so this governing council, executive board, and then the governing council, it's like FOMC that you familiar with Fed Reserve's arrangement. They have monthly meeting, ECB headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany. Okay, and executive board members and 12 national central bank heads. So you see different countries, central bank heads are then again become members of the governing council. And they also operate by consensus. They don't try to kind of see majority votes or anything, but they generally bring in the principle of consensus when it comes to decisions. So everybody agrees. And if somebody has disagreement, they try to make amends to the decision and bring a kind of agreement across all the members. Okay, then they say they target a particular rate. For instance, if they wanted to target interest rate, they target it at, let's say, 0.25%, 0.5%. They target that rate. And then, of course, through open market operation, they influence the market interest rates to behave around this target rate, or on the target rate. And they then decide, at discussions, why they wanted to maintain it, and all kind of explanations to the members. They give that. Okay, and also to stay at a manageable size, as because the European Union could expand and shrink. Countries can come in, countries can go in. Okay, so they have some flexibility that this governance council could also be introduced, a so-called rotational system that you are familiar with, Fed Reserve setup. So the European Central Bank also act to great extent in terms of this, and in certain literature, the most of the people argue European Central Bank is much more independent than any other central bank in the world, simply because it is not necessarily prioritizing interest of a single nation, single country. It is the interest of entire group of countries through European Central Bank. So they might not necessarily be influenced by the whims and desires of one single national member. So the element of non-renewable 8-year terms and the appointment arrangement and the decision making of consensus, all being put in with this element, and they argue that the European Central Bank is the most independent in today's context, right? So the argument for independence in the European Central Bank, as I said, they say it's most independent, okay? And long terms of executive board members, as we are discussing on a repeated basis, and they have their own budgets, so budgetary independence also there. Okay, but to some extent they have price stability as the foremost goal. They wanted to maintain stable, low and stable inflation level. So they don't have much more goals. So less goal independence in a way, because in today's context, the central banks all around the world do many functions. They try to kind of influence the employment generation, facilitate troubled institutions. ECB also does, but prioritizing so-called price stability as the key objective that they have. And the independence further supported by the charter cannot be changed by legislation, only by revision of the Maastricht Treaty. So it's everybody's agreement. All the countries in the European Union, they have to agree to a revision to a treaty like Maastricht, and they build up a kind of a charter through which the ECB was established. So independence is quite strong in terms of these elements that we are seeing in case of European Central Bank, and being restricted to a single very important key price stability objective also makes them independent, because the influence from political authorities are limited, because they can simply say, okay, our objective and our priority is price stability, so we are working for it, not anything else. So they can kind of push aside political influence in terms of their operation. So that's why they say it's most independent in a sense, right? Then you see other central banks, major central banks in the world. Bank of Canada, they controls monetary policy. Bank of England, they have instrument independence, so they can kind of move into price stability, financial system stability, and other related things. And Bank of Japan had a lot of influence from their finance ministry up until 1998, where the Bank of Japan law, new Bank of Japan law, was passed to have more independence. And in recent times, all around the world, you see the push for more independence in central banking. So this broadly kind of sets where the central banks and how the central banks operate in recent times. So at this point, I will conclude this lecture, and we can move into the money supply process for discussion. Any questions that you have before I move on to the new and very important segment, business segment of this program for your information? Right. So we can move in, and if you find anything, you can bring in for a further clarity. So the money supply process, I think you all have the handouts with you, is very, very important segment of this program, simply because you see, when it comes to monetary economics or the monetary policy, what matters there is the central bank's actions, okay, which often comes in the form of movements in money supply. So the money supply is the quantum of money available in the economy, right? At any moment, given moment of time that you take it, there are different compilation arrangements in money supply, but what you are simply seeing is this movements in money supply that in fact that influence the interest rates and overall economic condition or the health of the economy, and then of course through which it's affect everybody, you, me, and everybody else in the economy. So what matters here is when interest rates behave, you see the cost of financing changes. Because of cost of financing changes, you see the decisions of spending, different decisions of saving, and then of course the investments, okay, the budgetary process, and its influences across all other economic variables, even the exchange rate for that matter, right? So what matters is this central bank action, which ultimately drive the quantum of money, the money supply available in the economy to move here and there. So through which you probably see the macroeconomic variables shifts. Either even by directly targeting the interest rates, you just influence the money supply in the economy, while directly kind of hinting where the interest rate should be. So the way in which the central bank look at these things, okay, has a greater influence over the economy, and as a result, it affects all of us. Okay, so because of this reason and its impact to the economic activity, is very, very important to understand how money supply is determined. Okay, so how money supply is determined, who controls it, why it changes, how it changes, okay, how the control of this money supply being improved, are all kind of related questions one would interested to kind of understand. Okay, in this and subsequent sections we might be studying, we try to answer these questions by providing a detailed description on the money supply process. So we look at this money supply process, the mechanism that determines the level of money available in the economy. Okay, so we see various approaches to kind of define these as we move along in this discussion, and different sections that you might come across in today's discussion and possibly in our next discussion. So you can understand here the deposits maintained at banks remain one very important component of the money supply. So you, me, everybody keeps deposits, and these are part of the money supply in any economy. Okay, and it's also important to see how these deposits are created in the first step, and understanding through a money supply process is very important, because you and me, through our earnings, we might have brought in deposits cleanly, but at the same time there's another process through which deposits been created in the economy by lending process, because banks lend means you are creating a new deposits, and through that deposits that they lend. So it's a process, so that again facilitate the money supply process. So this chapter that we are going to discuss provides an overview of how the banking system creates these deposits, and try to describe the basic principles of money supply. And through this discussion, you will be able to kind of get a kind of a broader spectrum of understanding how the money supply influences other macroeconomic variables, and through which everybody's day-to-day economic activities. Any questions? Right. So you see the process that we are discussing here, and you can see, as I was explaining, there are three major players in the money supply process. One is always the central bank. Okay, so it's a Federal Reserve, or the ECB, or for that matter, Bank of England, or for the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. The central bank is a very important player. And then you see financial intermediaries, often the commercial banks. Okay, and in addition to that, depository institution and other financial intermediaries also play a role. But the banks, in the sense the commercial banks, are much more influential in this process. And then, of course, the people, depositors, individuals, and both institutions and individuals. So you see there, though, they also become very important, because they are the one who maintain deposits. Okay, so this money supply could then again include all currency, I mean, in circulation, and coins that's in circulation, and the balances held in accounts, checking and saving accounts. You see, checking accounts means accounts that does not have withdrawal restrictions. You can withdraw at any time. Saving accounts may have withdrawal restriction or maybe fixed type of saving instruments. So these also included in the money supply. Okay, and also there are different near money substitutes in the process, that also part of money supply. Okay, so the money supply, when it comes to an aggregate, it is the total value of money available in an economy at any given point of time. So you might kind of understood from our previous discussion, there are different M's being highlighted, from M0 to M2 to M2B to kind of M3, M4. You can go on like that, right? But what you are basically adding in that process is from most liquid component of money supply being taken as M0, and then you add on the other layers into the equation. So as you move on to a bigger M, what you simply see is less liquid component also added into the money supply. But it's starting from a most liquid component, and that remains the key in terms of how you wanted to influence the money supply process. So to understand this money supply process, it is very important to understand how a balance sheet of an individual, or for that matter a central bank, works. From a central bank's perspective, it is very important to see that they have assets and liabilities in their balance sheets. So always remember, the central bank's liability side, you can always see the currency that is in circulation. Whatever that you are having in your pocket, in your wallets, in whatever form that you have maintained. So these are in circulation, currency in circulation. And this is the liability of the central bank. What they have printed and put into circulation is a liability. And then the reserves, the banks maintain, right, deposits with the central banks. This could be a part of so-called statutory reserve, or for that matter, excess reserves, all possible, right? But what matters here is it is not central banks' own assets. It is basically somebody else's, that is banks, maintained with the central bank. So you can look at the liability side of the central bank's balance sheet. You could see, very importantly, the currency in circulation and reserves remains as two key liabilities. There are other liabilities, but we don't need to get into those stuff. For our understanding, currency in circulation and reserves is very much sufficient. And you look at the asset side of central banks, okay, everything that they have loaned out, lender of last reserves, open market operation, the window, open market discount window, whatever loans that the central bank extend to financial intermediaries are an asset. So it is the central bank's money that they have loaned it to the agencies. So with a possible arrangement, they might have got collateral, or sometimes without collateral. But these loans that they have extended is an asset of the central bank. And also, central banks invest in government securities and other financial assets. Often the government securities that you see, like treasury bills, treasury bonds, are assets in central bank's portfolio. So you have to understand very clearly to see that asset side and liability side of a financial institution. And it's no different. I mean, if you look at a bank, if you look at the asset side of the bank, loans are an asset, deposits are a liability. Deposits not belongs to the banks, but it's somebody else's, operated by the bank. Loans are banks, but they have extended to the borrower. So it's an asset in their portfolio. So similarly, what you simply see is the central bank's balance sheet in first place, and that will simplify for you to understand when it comes to the movements in this money supply process. Easy to understand first the central bank's position, and through which you understand what happens to the other leg of the equation. So when it comes to the Fed Reserve or Central Bank of Sri Lanka, what you understand here is the liability side. Liability side, you have the currency in circulation, right? And then you see the reserves. These are the deposits of banks at the central bank's vault. Okay, so then you see asset side, you see securities, mainly government securities, which are held in central bank's portfolio. Okay, and then you see the loans, often discount loans, okay, that provides banks with liquidity or reserves. So these assets and liability side is very important to understand, and the understanding of this would make you to understand the balance component of the money supply process discussion much more easy. Any questions? Right. So you see here, as I was mentioning, most liquid component of money supply. In a way, this is known as the monetary base, right? So what this monetary base is, that is the total amount of a currency, that is either circulated in the hands of the public or in the commercial bank deposits held in the central bank's reserves. So the monetary base is nothing but so-called currency in circulation and the reserves the banks kept with the central banks, right? So this measure of money supply is the most liquid component of the money supply process, and because of that, this is called as monetary base, or you can call it as high-powered money. Okay, so you can often find in compilation of money supply, often represented as M0, what you are seeing is the monetary base. You see currency in circulation and you see the reserves. So you can kind of write down an equation to say that monetary base MB, monetary base also known as high-powered money, I'm repeating that because this could use interchangeably all throughout our discussion and also all throughout the literature that you must be following. So when you see the monetary base, you have C, currency in circulation, and then you see R, total reserves in the banking system. So these two together is the most liquid form of money supply, right? So what you are basically representing here is the most liquid form of money supply, and you represent this in the form of an equation where MB equals C plus R. Please try to kind of get that into your understanding, because that would make very easy for you to take the discussion and different ways of understanding the process once we start kind of moving into more details. So the high-powered money or the monetary base is nothing but the currency in circulation plus the reserves maintained by banks with the central bank. So you can now represent this through an equation. MB equals C plus R. Right. So now we look at different form of central bank actions that influences the quantum of money available in the economy. Right. The central bank's actions which influences the quantum of money that's available in the economy. So they do open market operations. Open market operation includes different type of activities, but we take one by one, not everything, but we will take few of those to understand how that influences the overall position of quantum of money, and through which we can influence the basic high-powered money equation, and also we can add on to the money supply equation as we move on. Right? So when you see open market activities, let's take a purchase from non-bank public. But please understand, when central banks purchase from the market, they don't directly come to you and me and purchase, because we don't maintain accounts with the central bank. Right? So whatever assets that we hold, we maintain those assets with the financial intermediary. Let's assume a bank. So the bank holds our assets, and we might want banks to sell. Right? So central bank purchase these assets from non-bank public. That means not from a bank, but from a general public. But they borrow, not borrow, it's purchase from the non-bank public through a bank, because banks are the ones who maintains accounts with the central bank, not the general public. So as I mentioned, you have to now look at, often see, when you do a transaction of money supply, it's very easy to start from central bank's balance sheet. Yes, you can start from bank's balance sheet, no problem. But still, it's much more comfortable to understand the arrangement from a central bank's perspective. So when central banks open market operations purchase from the general public, they purchase what? The securities, government securities. So the securities are an asset in the central bank's books. So when they purchase the securities, that get added to the asset side of the central bank's balance sheet. That get added to the asset side of the central bank's balance sheet. You purchase, that gets added to your assets portfolio. Similarly, when the central bank, through open market operation, purchase from non-bank public, the assets come to the central bank's asset side. So you see, assets of central bank increases by the amount of purchase. In this instance, we assume it is $100 million. Right? So the securities held with the central bank, Federal Reserve Bank in this case, increases with this purchase by $100 million. So the asset side increases by $100 million. What immediately happens here is, when your asset side increases with the purchase, nobody gives you free lunch. You purchase assets, but you have to pay for it. Central bank also same. Central bank purchase the assets. Now central bank has to pay for the purchase that they have entertained. So $100 million of securities now in central bank's books. Immediately central bank has to pay for this particular amount, and they pay to the bank that has sold this central bank the so-called 100 million securities. And what central bank does in that process to settle the purchase is increase the reserves maintained by that bank with the central bank. They basically credit the account the bank maintained with the central bank. So in the central bank's book, the asset has increased, but at the same time, for this purchase of assets, they have to pay So they have created so-called liability in the form of reserves under, let's say, Bank A. So 100 million securities now central bank have. So 100 million reserves it has created in the name of that bank. So in central banks per se, the transaction is now clean. Securities cleared, reserves cleared. So both securities and reserves have increased by 100 million in both sides of asset side and the liability side of the central bank book. So this, the central bank's book reflect in the other side where the bank is concerned. So the bank is now looking at it. When the central bank has created the so-called reserves in their name, it's a liability in the central bank's book, but reserves are, it's their assets, the bank's assets maintained with the central bank. So they create the so-called reserves in the asset side of the bank. So reserves the liability in the central bank, but an asset in the banking system. So reserve side of the bank also increases by 100 million. But you know, this open market purchase is from non-bank public, not from the bank, but from the public. So it belongs to general public, somebody, institution or an individual. Let's assume like that. So the bank is ultimately requires to pay to this particular non-bank public. So they have to create a deposit in their books on behalf of this particular security that they have taken out from this non-bank public. So banking books, we'd look at the asset side would have 100 million in the form of reserves, and also a liability side would have 100 million as a deposits. They call it checkable deposits. You can withdraw at any time, right? Like a current account. Okay, so both banks books and central banks books is now very clear. When the open market purchase happened, okay, right? So the person selling the bonds to the Fed in the sense the Fed Reserve, the central bank, deposits the Fed check in the bank, because they not necessarily take that out and kind of clear off in the immediate go. But generally, I mean, it's the bank through which they come to the central bank in the form of open market transaction. It's not the general public directly go to the open market operation and transact. And identical results in the form of a bank is directly involved, like a Fed Reserve's open market operation purchase. So what you are basically seeing is when the open market purchase from non-bank public, or for that matter, a bank, so central bank could see its securities increases. At the same time, central bank's liability side, the reserves increases, because it's belong to a bank who sold that security to the central bank in this case. So similarly, you see the bank's books, the reserves is their assets maintained with the central bank. So the reserves increases in the asset side. But because it's a non-bank public, you see a liability also created in the books of the banks on behalf of this non-bank public as a checkable deposit. So it's 100 million and everything kind of cleared in this process. And then you see here, we are continuing this process, right? This non-bank public had what? Right? In his book, securities. Right? So you know he sold this security through the bank to the central bank. So in his books, securities have now reduced. Right? So his books, you see, immediately the securities have reduced by 100 in the asset side. But with this reduction, right, he requires to have compensated with currency payment. So that comes in as an asset for him. So from whom he gets his currency is from the bank, not from the central bank, because central bank initially had the reserves being created, and reserves being bank's books, you have seen an asset being correspondingly adjusted by the bank by creating a deposits, checkable deposits in the name of non-bank public. So when this non-bank public takes this checkable deposits into currency form, he gets the currency into his books, and the checkable deposits goes out from the bank's liability side. But effectively, because for this, the bank requires currency to be settled to the non-bank public, they liquidate the reserve with the central bank in the form of currency in circulation. So they pay to the ultimate security seller through the bank in the currency. So currency in circulation replaces the reserve in the central bank's book. Originally it was reserves, but subsequently when the general public convert their checkable deposits into currency, you see the currency in circulation increases in central bank's books, because bank has to pay. Bank would pay from reducing their reserves, because by the amount of the money that the general public withdraw, they have to pay currency. So they bring in currency, and that means central bank has now put to circulation 100 million. This is nothing but the value of the security that they have absorbed. Okay, so the person selling the bonds now cashes the Fed's check invariably, and what you are basically seeing is the reserves do not change. It increased, but then with the currency in circulation increases, the reserves get cancelled off. Okay, and the currency in circulation increases by the amount of the open market purchase, and as a result, monetary base MB is nothing but C plus R. Okay, now C has increased temporarily. In the interim, C didn't change. When the reserves were built, R has increased. So now R has returned back to its normal level. No change in R, but C, currency in circulation, has increased. So this what ultimately happens when an open market purchase from non-bank public by the Federal Reserve. Through that process, you can see how that has influenced the money supply in the economy. So by purchasing assets, central bank creates a liability either in the form of reserves or in the form of currency in circulation. And whatever the security that they have purchased become an asset in central bank's book. Then corresponding changes happen in general public's books and the bank in the interim. So this process is very clear. Any questions? Right. So you see here, what we are discussing is open market purchase. Right. So you have now got a kind of a feel in the form of how the assets and liabilities adjust in central bank's books, and through which the monetary base, the high-powered money. Right. So as a summary, what you have to see here is when an open market purchase happens, okay, its impact on reserves depends on whether the seller, the non-bank public in this case, of the security bonds, that's what securities in this case, okay, keeps the proceeds from the sale in currency or in deposits. So if he keeps in deposits, you can see the checkable deposits would be there, reserves would be there. But if you wanted to convert into currency, the checkable deposits would go out from the equation, and you will see the currency in circulation increases. In the central bank's books, reserves would go out and currency in circulation would become a liability. So the impact of this open market purchase depends on the seller's desire whether to keep it in currency or in the deposits form. Okay, and ultimately the effect of an open market purchase on the monetary base, MB, always increases the monetary base by the amount of the purchase. You have seen either it's in the reserves form or in the currency in circulation form, whatever form, or in both if he has converted only a part of that checkable deposit, both reserves and currency in circulation will increase. But ultimately, the amount of open market purchase would be seen to increase the monetary base by that same amount. So you can basically say a purchase by the open market operations of the central bank would increase the monetary base by the amount of so-called open market purchase. Okay, any questions? Right, so you see that influence in the equation, but at the same time we will now get into the other type of open market operations. What we have now discussed is a purchase. What we are now going to see is a sale, the opposite of a purchase by the open market operation of the central bank. Okay, so when the central bank sell, what they do basically is from their assets in the form of securities, treasury bills, treasury bonds that they have, other securities also they can have in their portfolio, but often you see it is the treasury bills and treasury bonds that they hold in their portfolio. So when they sell the securities held in their portfolio, and what you immediately see is when the security reduces from the central bank's books, the Federal Reserve books, you can again see $100 million transaction. The securities get reduced by 100 million in the central bank's book. But again, this is a transaction that they do with the non-bank public. And in the interim, you can see the bank is there. Through that bank, only the non-bank public transact with the central bank, right? So the security get reduced in the central bank book, but the security goes to the account of the purchaser through bank to this non-bank public. Then you can see that central bank's books, the assets reduces by $100 million, and in the general public hand, asset increases by 100 million because he get the security from the central bank. That one leg of the transaction, the security leg, is now very clear. Open market sale, central bank has sold it from its own portfolio to a non-bank public, and as a result, central bank's asset side reduces, securities reduces by the amount of transaction, but at the same time, this security get added into the non-bank public's books, where he get the purchased amount from the central banks here. Central bank sold, he purchased. But central bank would not sell for nothing. The general public or the non-bank public has to pay for the purchase what he made from the open market operation, or the open market operation what they sold to the general public now requires general public to settle the transaction by paying for the asset that they have purchased from the Fed Reserve or the central bank's books. So what immediately happens is, when they pay back to the central bank, by the amount of the payment, the currency that is available in the economy get reduced. Whatever you had with you, either in the bank or inside your house or wherever that you have kept with you, now requires to be handed over to the central bank. So what central bank gets is now currency. So when you get the currency back to the central bank's books, the currency in circulation in the economy reduces by that amount, and as a result, central bank's liabilities, because now the currency they have previously held in currency in circulation in the economy is coming back to the central banks. When it comes into the central bank, by that amount, the currency in circulation reduces. So in the liability side, when they had currency in circulation as a liability, because part of that has now come back to the central bank, by that amount, currency in circulation reduces in the central bank book, $100 million in this case, and similarly, non-bank public, that means the currency in circulation in the economy is also reduces by the $100 million. So the sale in the central bank book first created assets to decline by the amount of sale in the central bank's portfolio. So security is reduced by 100 million in this instance. And for this sale, the general public or the non-bank public has to settle. He has paid it through currency in circulation. So by that amount, the liability of the central bank, the currency in circulation liability, get reduced. So what you are basically seeing is an open market sale reduces the monetary base, MB, by the amount of the sale. So you can see here, C in the equation reduces by 100 million US dollars. There is no impact to reserves in this instance because we have not brought in the bank into the equation. If that gone to the bank, yes, there's a interim movement in reserves too, but ultimately it's the currency in circulation that impact the monetary base equation. So what you are basically seeing here is the effect of open market operations, OMO, on the monetary base is much more certain than the effect on reserves. So the purchase we discussed in the last example increases the monetary base. A sale, open market sale, reduces the monetary base. And it's very clear in the form of impact coming through currency in circulation adjustment than the impact through reserves adjustment. I believe it's clear. Any questions? right? So you see the influence of open market sale and open market purchase, right? So we can move on to see a shift from deposits into currency. Okay, so you can understand the fact that the deposits maintained by the banks is got converted in this instance into a currency form. As I was repeatedly mentioning, it is easy to see that from central bank's perspective first, very clear to understand then. So deposits means the reserves in the central bank's books. So it's a liability. Right? So when you see reserves, that's the deposits of a bank with the central bank. They wanted to convert this into currency. First, you see reserves in the central bank's liability side reduces by the amount of the transaction. So you can see minus 100 million US dollars reserves decline in the liability side of the Fed Reserve System's book. That's the central bank's book. But they convert this into the currency. So the reduction in reserves is now reverted back to the book central bank's liability side in the form of currency in circulation. Because they want the currency, they have converted the deposit. Deposit reduced, reserves reduced for that amount, and currency in circulation increase for that amount. 100 million reserves reduction, 100 million currency in circulation increases. All liabilities, reserves also a liability, currency in circulation also a liability in the central bank's book. So immediately when this happens, what you simply see in the central bank book is now clear, but what you are now seeing in the banking systems book, they see their reserves decline because central bank, they have requested the central bank to convert them into currency in circulation. So the reserves in the central banks is a liability in the central bank books, but bank's books it's a asset. So by the same amount of reserves that the central bank is converting is reduced in the bank's book also in the asset side now. But correspondingly, because central bank has created currency in circulation for that in the name of the so-called bank who wanted this conversion from deposits into currency, right? There's a checkable deposits initially gets in the form of adjustment because this is a deposit, not bank maintains deposits, it's the bank's deposits that they maintain with the central bank. Okay, they maintain deposits of their depositors. Okay, so it's get converted into currency means by that amount, the deposits also reduces in the bank's book. By that reduction is reflected in the non-bank so-called general public's reduction in deposits value because he wants ultimately his deposits being converted to currency. So the checkable deposits also reduces in bank's book, but at the same time it reduces in the so-called non-bank public books also. But because the currency in circulation, he wants these adjustments to be compensated by currency. The increase in currency in circulation is now reflected in the currency of the non-bank public by 100 million equals. So what you are basically seeing is the conversion from deposits into currency has no impact to the monetary base. Okay. So net effect on monetary liabilities is zero here. Reserves are changed by random fluctuation in the process, but effectively monetary base is stable in this process. Reserves decline, but correspondingly compensated by currency in circulation. C has increased, R has declined in the MB equation. So it's a process through which the deposits to currency shifts worked out in this case. Okay, so open market operations that we are discussing: purchase, sale, conversion from deposits to currency, different type of open market operation, how that influence the monetary base. This is what we are discussing with examples. Now, another very common open market operation where the central bank loans to financial intermediaries. The banks borrow from the central bank. Central bank lends through various schemes under open market operations, discount window, lender of last resort, various forms of loaning to financial intermediaries. And you know, the loans are an asset in central bank's books. So you can see here, when the financial intermediaries wants to borrow from the central bank extend them as a loan, and you know the loans are an asset in central bank's book. So immediately asset side of the central bank increases by the amount of borrowing by the financial intermediary. Loans increases in this case by 100 million US dollars. So when the central bank loan it to a bank, they don't go and give that money to that bank's head office. What they basically does is the account maintained by the bank with the central bank get credited. So what that means is the bank's reserves increases by the amount of loan central bank has extended. Loan increases in the asset side of the central bank book, reserves increases in the liability side of the central bank's book. Right? So this gets reflected in the bank's book, where loans become a liability because they have to pay to the central bank. Right? And then the reserves that the central bank has created on behalf of this bank, when they borrowed from them, become an asset. So correspondingly, what central bank has created in the form of a loan and reserves reflected in the bank's books too. When a bank borrow from the central bank, loans increases as an asset in central bank portfolio, and central bank's liabilities, the reserves, the amount of the loan that now get credited in bank's account also increases. So the liability reserves increases by 100 million in this case. So what monetary liabilities of the central bank here is increased by the reserves amount, MB equals C plus R. R increases by the $100 million that we were discussing, and the monetary base also increases by this amount. So you are seeing here the influence into the monetary base. Purchase, loans increases the monetary base. Sell, open market sell, reduces the monetary base. Conversion from deposit to currency has no influence on the monetary base. So this is what we are trying to kind of, get at from these discussions. So you are seeing how these open market operations have influenced the money supply process all this time. Right. So now open market operations affect the monetary base. It's very clear. We had examples, we looked at the ways through which that happens. But there are other factors that also affect the monetary base. Okay, so what you see simply here is the types of other factors that also influence the monetary base. One is a float. So it's invariably a float is a possibility of a dual counting in the interim process of a transaction. Float is a money in the banking system that is briefly counted twice due to the delays in processing instructions. Checks means instructions. You give instructions to the banks. A float is created when a bank credits a customer's account as soon as check is deposited. But now most of the banks don't deposit the check until it get cash from the counterparty. That's the process now you see. But in the interim, there's a possibility, right? So it's get deposited into the account. So you basically know your account has increased. But banks are now smart enough. They don't deposit credit your account until that get cash from the counterparty. But it also quite fast now. But there's a process involved. So float is that the interim period where this get accounted in both recipient as well as the payer. So it is there in payers, whoever who has given you the check in his accounts, that money is there. Until that get withdrawn from his account and got transferred to your account through this process, if the check is deposited by your bank, it reflects in your account as well as in his account. Okay, so the amount of check appears in accounts of both the recipients and payers bank is a float. Basically instructions of transaction that get settled in one side, but in the interim it could reflect in both sides of the equation, and that's a float. But now most of the financial intermediaries, they are working through electronic efficient ICT arrangements, so they take care of the possibility that it reflects in both sides being taken out from the equation, right? So that's why I said you don't get your account credited until your check get cash from the other bank. So that's one influence that also affect the monetary base in the interim period. Then you see treasury deposits. That means the government deposits at the Federal Reserve. What happens when the treasury deposits is the currency in circulation reduces. Whatever treasury receipts being transferred to the central bank, and that money is not available in the economy for circulation. Federal Reserve is the central bank. That also influences the monetary base. Then you see interventions in the foreign exchange market. When the central banks, other than open market operation, also transact in the foreign exchange market. They buy, sell foreign exchange. When they buy foreign exchange available with the central bank goes to the market. That means the foreign exchange held with the central bank's portfolio reduces, and that foreign exchange increases in the banking system, but the monetary base is computed not by the foreign exchange available in the banking system, but the domestic currency. That's the base of monetary compilations. So for that central bank selling of foreign exchange, the banks who purchase that has to pay. They pay to the central bank in the form of currency. So what happened there is currency in circulation reduces. That is a foreign exchange sell by the central bank. Foreign exchange buy by the central bank, purchase by the central bank is the opposite. So when they purchase foreign exchange from the market, the foreign exchange available in the market comes to the central bank. So the central bank's reserves, foreign exchange reserves, increases, but correspondingly central bank has to pay domestic money. So the amount of money that they pay it out to the bank increases the currency in circulation, or they might immediately put that in the reserves form of the bank who sold foreign exchange. Either way, that influences the monetary base. So these are the possibilities outside open market operation. You see the monetary base get influenced. Okay, so these elements are very important to kind of change the base money or high powered money that we are seeing in the economy. Then you see overview of the central banks to control the monetary base. Effectively, open market operation is the most influential form of monetary base control by the central banks, because it's their decision whether to buy, whether to sell. It's a decision by the central bank. But you know, loans also one form. But who decide how much to borrow? It's not the central bank, but by the banks. So that influences the monetary base, but it's a decision not by the central bank, but by the bank. So its ability to control monetary base in that sense is subject to banks borrowing from the central banks. But open market operations is much more influential. But because there's a loan component, borrowed component also available, now you can split the monetary base into two components. So you have monetary base MB minus BR is borrowed money, borrowed reserves from the central bank, because whenever a bank borrows from the central bank, what they do is they increase the reserves in the name of that bank. So it's a borrowed reserves of that bank. So monetary base minus borrowed reserves equals monetary base non-borrowed. So you can see here monetary base comprised of both borrowed and non-borrowed components. You can write down the monetary base equation in the form of monetary base non-borrowed equals monetary base minus borrowed reserves. The money supply is positively related to both the non-borrowed monetary base and the level of borrowed reserves. Anyway, if you see borrowed or non-borrowed increases, monetary base increases. Okay, it's positively related to the monetary base. So increasing borrowed reserves increases the monetary base, increasing non-borrowed reserves increases the monetary base. Any questions? Right. So then you see a process called a multiple deposit creation. This is very important simply because the banks can create from a single deposit number of deposits. They can create multiple times of deposits, and thereby they can increase the money supply. Okay. So what you are basically seeing here is a First National Bank, one bank, a single bank in the equation. Okay. First sells its securities, thereby its asset side reduces the securities by, let's say, 100 million. And through this 100 million, the Fed Reserve's picture is not here. Okay. The central bank's picture is not here in this table. But you are basically, when the bank sells security, it's purchased by the open market operation, that increases the asset securities in the central bank's book. But correspondingly, central bank has to pay for this purchase in the form of creating a reserves. That's a liability side, but reserves is an asset in the bank's books. Okay. Right. So you see here, First National Banks did that. They have sold security, they have got reserves. So both asset side security reduced, reserves increased. But then, you know, this security that they sold is the non-bank publics. And that reserves that central bank has created in the name of First National Bank is not necessarily the First National Bank's money, but it is that person who sold security, his money. So you create a checkable deposit in his name. Okay. But until he withdraws that money, right? So the First National Bank can loan this money to anybody who comes and borrow from the First National Bank. So loans are assets in bank's book. So effectively, they can loan up to 100 million now, the checkable deposits that they have created on that phase, because reserves are there in the central bank's books until that checkable deposits get converted. So what you are basically seeing here is when 100 million of assets being sold and reserves being created, everything of that reserve is not required by central banks, because central banks requires most of the banks to maintain only a portion of their deposits with them as reserves. Everything else they can use for other purposes. That's why we have so-called statutory reserve ratios or requirements, SRR, statutory reserve ratio or requirement, SRR. That SRR, let's say if it is 10%, every 100 rupees of deposits, you have to keep only 10% of that, that is 10 rupees in the central banks as reserves, required reserves. But banks, if they keep 100 out of this 100, because it's checkable deposits 100, only 10 they require to keep. If the SRR is 10%, they are keeping 100 there. So that is excess reserves. This excess reserves that they are keeping with the central banks give them the option to create another round of deposits, and then they can lend it, and another round of deposits, and they can lend it until the excess reserves get cancelled out. This is what the multiple deposit creation means. It's a process through which the bank's ability to create multiple deposits being checked. And interestingly, you understand the Central Bank of Sri Lanka currently stipulate so-called SRR, statutory reserve requirement, as only 2% of deposits. Not 10%, 2%. And different central banks in the world keeps different ratios, but they are very close to lower side. Sri Lanka also had 6%, and subsequently it has been brought down to 5%. In the past, it may be 10%. There are different times, but currently it is only 2%. So the requirement in terms of banks to keep reserves with the central bank is only amounts to that statutory reserve requirement, that is 2%. Okay, so then you see this, the banking system, how they run this multiple deposit creation, assuming that the statutory reserve or the reserve requirement is only 10%. Here you have to understand it's 10% in this example that we are discussing here. Bank A, they have now reserves in the central bank book as 100. They got a checkable deposit created in the name of that security transaction for 100. But how much they have to keep as reserve requirement? 10% of this 100. That means 10. That's what the bank has to keep with central bank. So they keep that 10 and take out that 90 and give as a loan. That's why you see now loans as 90 in the second box. From this 90, right? Initially they had 100. Actually they have to keep only 10 of that as reserves. Balance they can loan it as 90. So when they loan, they again create another account in the name of that borrower, a checkable deposit, but they know still 90 is there in the central banks as reserves, effectively excess reserves. From this 90, how much reserves that they have to maintain is only 10%, that is 9. So it's effectively should reflect as only 9 in the central bank's books for this particular deposit, plus previous checkable deposits 10, it's 19 out of 100, 10. So 9 and 10 is 19. So you see they can still loan another 81 to a new loan. So this excess reserves that you are maintaining with the central bank can run up to further deposits that the bank can create. This is what banks does. When somebody creates a deposits, they require to keep with the central bank only a portion, not entirety. So the balance they can loan it to another person, and from that they can create a deposits, only a portion they can keep as reserves, balance they can loan it. They can go on until excess reserves wipes out from the equation. And there's a model, simple excess deposits creation equation. We will come to this point in our next discussion. So we can stop at this point today. And please remember, this is a very, very important area that you are discussing. You can follow up the same discussion next week also. We will continue to get into a more complex, but interestingly, the real economic per se, how the money supply process is determined. So we will get back to that in our next class next week. So we'll stop at this point, and if you have any question, you can just pause it to me. Otherwise, we will meet in our discussion next week. Thank you.